June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 am. Operation Barbarossa. The largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft crashed across the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Soviet Union was not ready. In the first 48 hours, the Luftwaffe achieved something that defied military logic. Total air supremacy. Not air superiority, air supremacy. The complete, utter, absolute destruction of the enemy's ability to contest the skies. Soviet airfields were hit before dawn. Rows of I-16 fighters and obsolete TB-3 bombers were caught on the ground, lined up wingtip to wingtip like targets at a shooting gallery. German Stukas and Messerschmitt 110s swept over at low altitude and systematically obliterated them. By the end of the first day, the Soviet Air Force had lost 1,200 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground, never even got airborne. The few Soviet fighters that did manage to take off were hopelessly outclassed. The I-16 Rata, a stubby little biplane fighter that looked like it belonged in 1935, because it was designed in 1935, was facing the Messerschmitt Bf-109F. The 109F was faster, more maneuverable, better armed, and flown by pilots with combat experience from Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. It was a massacre. Within a week, the Luftwaffe was reporting kill ratios of 10-1, sometimes 20-1. The Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were the apex predators, the undisputed masters of the sky over the Eastern Front. But the real terror, the weapon that would haunt Soviet soldiers for the next 2 years, wasn't the fighters. It was the Stuka, the Junkers Jew. 87. Stuka, slow, ugly, vulnerable to fighters. But in the early years of Barbarossa, with no Soviet fighters to challenge it, the Stuka was a weapon of psychological and physical destruction. Picture this. You're a Soviet infantryman. Your unit is dug in along a defensive line. You can hear artillery in the distance, tank engines, the rumble of the German advance. And then you hear it, a high-pitched, terrifying wail. The Jericho trumpet, a siren mounted on the Stuka's landing gear, designed specifically to create terror. You look up and you see them. Gull-winged silhouettes diving nearly vertical, impossibly steep, right at you. There's nothing you can do. You can't run. You can't hide. You just press yourself into the dirt and pray. The Stuka's dive brakes scream. The bombs release. The aircraft pulls up with a gut-wrenching G-load that would black out most pilots. And where you were dug in, where your friends were dug in, is now a crater. The Stuka was a precision weapon, a scalpel. It could hit a bridge, a command post, a tank, and it did this with near impunity because there were no Soviet fighters to stop it. The Red Army was being dissected, not just defeated, systematically destroyed. Stalin, watching his army collapse, his air force annihilated, his country being torn apart by panzers and Stukas, was in a state of barely controlled panic. He needed a solution. Desperately, immediately. Stalin's generals briefed him on the situation. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Soviet fighters couldn't compete. The I-16 was obsolete. The newer Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters were still in short supply and flown by inexperienced pilots. But Stalin wasn't interested in dogfighting the Messerschmitts. He couldn't win that war. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What he needed was something else entirely. He needed a plane that could support his soldiers on the ground, that could kill German tanks, that could survive German anti-aircraft fire, that could operate even when the Luftwaffe controlled the sky. He didn't need a fighter to joust with 109s at 20,000 feet. He needed a plane that could fly at 50 feet, directly into the teeth of German flak and destroy panzers, and then come home. In other words, he needed a flying T-34 tank. Stalin summoned his chief aircraft designer, Sergei Ilyushin, and gave him an order that was brutally simple. Build me a plane that cannot be shot down from the ground and can barely be shot down from the air. The order was clear. This aircraft didn't need to be fast. It didn't need to be elegant. It didn't need to dogfight. It needed to survive. And it needed to kill tanks. This was the birth of the IL-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank, the most produced military aircraft in human history, and it would change the war. Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin was not a typical aircraft designer. Men like Willy Messerschmitt in Germany or R.J. Mitchell in Britain were obsessed with speed, with elegance, with pushing the boundaries of aerodynamics. They designed beautiful aircraft, sleek, powerful machines that looked fast even sitting still. Ilyushin didn't care about beautiful. He cared about effective. His background was in engineering, not art. He understood that the Eastern Front wasn't going to be won by graceful dogfights at altitude. It was going to be won in the mud, in the blood, at treetop level, with flak bursting all around, trying to destroy tanks before they overran your position. He had a radical idea, an idea that defied every convention of aircraft design. And that idea would create one of the most important weapons of World War II. Here's how you built an attack aircraft in 1940. You started with an airframe, aluminum, steel tubing, fabric, designed to be as light as possible. Then you bolted on some armor plates, a piece of steel behind the pilot's seat, maybe some around the engine. Strategic protection for critical areas. That's how the Germans designed the Stuka. That's how the Americans designed the A-20 Havoc. Airframe first, armor second. Ilyushin turned that logic on its head. He started with the armor. The IL-2's central structure, what Soviet engineers called the Bronné Trub, the armored bathtub, was a single monocoque shell of welded steel. Not bolted, welded, seamless. The armor thickness varied. 7 millimeters on the sides, up to 12 millimeters on the front and bottom. And critically, it was sloped, angled to deflect incoming rounds rather than absorb them flat on. This armored shell, this bathtub, contained everything vital. The pilot, the engine, the radiators, the fuel tanks, the oil cooler, mostly. The ammunition, everything that, if hit, would kill the aircraft or the pilot. The rest of the plane, the wings, the tail section, the rear fuselage, wood and fabric. That's right. Much of the IL-2 was built from wood, plywood to be specific. Because Ilyushin understood something fundamental. You don't need to armor what doesn't matter. If a cannon shell blew a hole in the wooden wing, the plane would still fly. If a bullet punched through the fabric-covered tail, who cares? As long as the armored core, the bathtub, was intact, the aircraft could survive. This was revolutionary. The armor wasn't just protection, it was the airframe. It was structural. It carried the loads, the wings attached to it, the engine bolted to it. The IL-2 wasn't an aircraft with armor. It was armor that could fly. Of course, there was a cost. The armored bathtub weighed 700 kilograms. That's 1,540 pounds of steel welded into the core of the aircraft. The result was a plane that was, by any conventional measure, terrible. It was heavy, fully loaded. The IL-2 weighed over 6 tons. That's heavier than many medium bombers. It was slow, top speed, barely 250 miles per hour at low altitude. The Stuka, by comparison, could hit 255 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt 109 could do 390 miles per hour. It was clumsy. Pilots described the handling as flying a brick, sluggish roll rate, heavy on the controls, took forever to turn. You didn't maneuver an IL-2. You aimed it like pointing a gun. And it looked like it had been designed by someone who had never seen an airplane before. Thick, stocky fuselage, stubby wings, a greenhouse canopy that made it look like a flying delivery truck. When German pilots first encountered it in combat, their reaction was disbelief followed by mockery. What is this thing? It was agricultural, crude, Soviet in the worst possible way, utilitarian to the point of ugliness. A flying tractor. The Luftwaffe pilots nicknamed it the Betonbomber, the concrete bomber, because only concrete could be that ugly, that slow, and that heavy. The Experten, the German aces, men with 50, 100, 200 kills, saw it as target practice, a slow, non-maneuvering, predictable target just lumbering through the sky. Easy meat. And then they tried to shoot it down. The Luftwaffe produced the highest-scoring aces in aviation history. Erich Hartmann, 352 confirmed kills, the highest-scoring ace of all time. Gerhard Barkhorn, 301 kills. Günther Rohl, 275 kills. These weren't just good pilots. They were apex predators. They had trained for years. They flew the best aircraft in the world. They had experience from multiple theaters of war. They were, quite simply, the most lethal fighter pilots ever to take to the skies. Their weapon of choice was the 20mm cannon, the MG-151/20, mounted in the nose or wings of the Bf-109 and FW-190. This wasn't a machine gun. This was an autocannon firing explosive shells. A single, well-placed burst, maybe a 2-second squeeze of the trigger, could shred a Spitfire, could blow the tail off a P-51 Mustang, could set an IL-2's contemporary, the P-2 bomber, on fire in seconds. It was a precise, deadly, elegant weapon in the hands of precise, deadly, elegant pilots. And then they met the IL-2. Imagine you're a German ace. You're flying combat air patrol over the front lines. You've got 50 kills to your name. You're confident, experienced. Your 109 is perfectly maintained. Your guns are sighted, and you're hunting. You spot a formation of IL-2s, 4, maybe 6 of them, low altitude, maybe 500 feet, slow, predictable, flying straight toward German positions. You smile, easy kills, you dive, line up behind one, perfect deflection shot. You're 200 meters behind, you can't miss, you squeeze the trigger, your 20mm cannons roar. You see the tracer rounds arc toward the target. See the impact sparking along the fuselage, and nothing happens. The IL-2 doesn't explode, doesn't catch fire, doesn't even waver. You fire again, longer burst, more shells. You're sure you're hitting it, you can see the impacts. The IL-2 continues flying, straight and level, like you're not even there. One Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Knock, later wrote in his memoir, "We would fire everything we had, and the shells just bounced off. They ricocheted. We couldn't believe it. It was like shooting at a tank." Another pilot whose name was lost to history, but whose account was recorded by German military intelligence, described his first encounter. "I put a full burst into the engine from 100 meters. Nothing. I hit the fuselage. Nothing. I thought my guns were malfunctioning. Then I realized it was armored, completely armored." The mockery stopped very quickly, and it was replaced by frustration, then anger, then grudging respect mixed with dread. But the early IL-2s had a fatal flaw. Stalin, in his desperate rush to get the aircraft into production, had made a critical error. To save weight and increase speed, he ordered the first IL-2s to be built as single-seaters. No rear gunner. The armored bathtub protected the front and sides, but the rear, completely vulnerable. The experienced Luftwaffe pilots quickly figured this out. You couldn't penetrate the armor from the front or sides. Fine. Attack from above and behind. The wooden rear fuselage, the tail section, the control cables, all unprotected. The losses were catastrophic. IL-2 squadrons were being decimated. Pilots were dying by the hundreds. Reports flooded back to Moscow. The IL-2 was being slaughtered, not by flak, it could survive flak, by fighters attacking from the rear. Stalin's response was characteristically blunt. He sent a telegram to the factory directors at the aviation plant. The telegram is famous. Every historian of the Eastern Front knows it. It read, "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs IL-2 aircraft, like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. I demand more machines. This is my final warning." The threat was clear. Produce more IL-2s and fix the problem or face the consequences. In Stalin's USSR, consequences often meant a bullet. The fix was made quickly. The IL-2M was born. Same armored bathtub, same engine, same weapons, but now with a second crewman, a rear gunner, sitting in an exposed position behind the pilot, armed with a 12.7mm Berezin UB machine gun. The rear gunner position was not inside the armored bathtub. He sat in the wooden rear fuselage, with minimal protection, a small armor plate behind his back. That was it. His life expectancy was measured in missions, sometimes single-digit missions. Often rear gunners were drawn from punishment battalions, soldiers who had committed infractions. Deserters who'd been caught, men Stalin's regime considered expendable. But now the flying tank could bite back. And the war was about to get very frustrating for the Luftwaffe. Let's be very clear about something. The IL-2 Sturmovik was nicknamed the flying tank by the Germans. The Soviets had a different name for it. Letayushchai grob, the flying coffin. Both names were accurate. Flying an IL-2 was a suicide mission. Not figuratively, literally. The life expectancy of a newly trained IL-2 pilot arriving at the front in 1942 was approximately 10 missions. 10. Some didn't survive their first. The attrition rate was apocalyptic. Why? Because the IL-2's mission profile was death incarnate. You took off, you flew low, and I mean low, 50 to 150 feet above the ground, directly toward German positions. You flew straight into the densest anti-aircraft fire on the planet. The Germans learned very quickly that you couldn't let IL-2s reach your tanks, so they packed the front lines with flak. 20mm guns, 37mm guns, quad-mounted machine guns, everything they had, pointing up. And you flew into that. The sky would turn black with flak bursts, tracer rounds crisscrossing like a spider web. The sound, even over your engine, was a constant roar of explosions. You didn't evade. You couldn't. The IL-2 was too slow, too clumsy to dodge. You just flew through it, straight through the storm of steel. You reached your target, a tank column, a supply convoy, an artillery position. You lined up, released your rockets, your bombs, fired your cannons. And then you turned around and flew back through the same hell. The armored bathtub would save you from most of it, but not all. Pilots came back with shrapnel wounds, with blood in the cockpit, with instruments shot out. And the rear gunner? He was fully exposed. Sitting in a wooden fuselage, no armor except a thin plate at his back. If a flak shell burst near the tail, he was dead. If a 109 attacked from above and got past his gun, he was dead. If anything hit the rear fuselage with enough force to tear apart the wood, he was gone. The rear gunners of IL-2s had the worst survival rate of any position in Soviet military aviation. They were heroes, every single one of them. But here's the thing that drove the Germans absolutely insane. Even when they hit the IL-2, even when they poured rounds into it, even when they damaged it severely, it kept flying. The stories, the legends, started to accumulate. IL-2S returning to base with over 500 bullet and shrapnel holes. The wooden wings and tail sections looked like Swiss cheese. The fabric covering was in tatters, but the armored bathtub was intact. The engine was running. The pilot was alive. One documented case from 1943. An IL-2 was hit by sustained anti-aircraft fire. The entire wooden tail section was blown off, just gone. The rear gunner with it. The aircraft should have been uncontrollable. The pilot somehow managed to keep it flying, using only the trim tabs, tiny control surfaces usually used for minor adjustments. He nursed it back to base, crash-landed, walked away. Another case. An IL-2 took a direct hit from a German 88mm flak gun. An 88mm shell is designed to kill tanks. The shell hit the armored bathtub, just behind the cockpit. The armor held. The shell did not penetrate. It dented the armor plate, cracked some welds, but didn't go through. The pilot felt the impact, like being hit with a sledgehammer, but he was alive. He completed his mission and flew home. German pilots began reporting, with increasing frustration, that it would take their entire ammunition load to bring down a single IL-2. One Bf-10-9 carried 200 rounds for its 20mm cannons. That's about 10 seconds of sustained fire, enough to destroy 2 or 3 normal aircraft. Against the IL-2, maybe you'd get 1 kill if you were lucky, if you hit the right spot. The mockery had turned to sheer, unadulterated frustration. Luftwaffe after-action reports from 1942 and 1943 are full of complaints. Pilots describing dumping hundreds of rounds into IL-2s with minimal effect. Experten, aces with dozens of kills, complaining that the Sturmovik was wasting their ammunition. Because while you were spending 5 minutes trying to kill one IL-2, circling, attacking, firing, attacking again, that IL-2's squadron mates were destroying German tanks, and other Soviet fighters were positioning to jump you. The Germans did eventually figure out the weak points. The oil cooler. There was a small, vulnerable oil cooler on the underside of the IL-2, partially exposed. If you could get underneath the aircraft and hit it with cannon fire, the engine would overheat and seize. But that required a very difficult attack angle, diving under a low-flying aircraft while dodging ground fire. The wooden wings. From directly above, you could shred the wooden wing structure with sustained fire. But again, difficult to angle, and the IL-2 could fly with significant wing damage. The rear gunner first. Kill the exposed gunner, then attack the wooden tail section and control surfaces. But that rear gunner, even knowing he was a dead man, would fight like hell. Many German pilots took hits from those 12.7mm rear guns. It was work. Hard, dangerous, frustrating work. And most damning of all, while the German ace was busy trying to kill one IL-2, the other 20 IL-2s in the formation were methodically erasing a panzer column from existence. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk. The largest tank battle in human history. The Germans had assembled a massive armored force for Operation Citadel. Over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the new Tigers and Panthers, the most advanced, most deadly tanks in the world. The plan was to pinch off the Kursk salient, encircle and destroy Soviet forces, and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were ready. They had built layered defenses, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, and they had tanks. 3,600 T-34s dug in and waiting. But they also had something else. The sky was full of IL-2s, hundreds of them, flying in massive formations, sometimes 20, 30, 40 aircraft at once. Wave after wave, relentless. This wasn't a duel. This wasn't a carefully choreographed dogfight between aces. This was an extermination. The IL-2s carried a terrifying loadout. 23mm or 37mm cannons in the wings, capable of penetrating the thinner top armor of German tanks. RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, unguided, inaccurate, but devastating when they hit. And most deadly of all, PTA-B, anti-tank bomblets. The PTA, the 2.5-1.5, was a shaped charged submunition. Each IL-2 could carry up to 192 of them in cassettes. On the attack run, the cassettes would open and scatter these small bomblets over a wide area. Each bomblet could penetrate up to 70 millimeters of armor. That's enough to kill a Panzer IV from above. Even the mighty Tiger, with its 25 millimeter top armor, was vulnerable. A single IL-2, making one pass, could blanket an entire tank formation with these bomblets. It was like aerial artillery, saturation attack. The Germans had never experienced anything like it. Their elegant Tigers and Panthers, masterpieces of engineering, were being destroyed by crude, slow, flying tractors that wouldn't die when you shot them. The Luftwaffe had aces, men with 100, 200, 300 kills. The best pilots in the world. The Soviet Union had factories. By the end of World War II, Soviet industry had produced 36,183 IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft. 36,000. It is the most produced military aircraft in all of human history. More than the P-51 Mustang, more than the Spitfire, more than any other single aircraft design. The Germans couldn't shoot them down fast enough, even when they did. When a lucky burst hit the oil cooler, when they managed to kill one, another dozen were taking off from Soviet airfields. It was a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the side that can absorb losses and keep producing wins. The IL-2 was designed for that war, designed to be produced quickly in massive numbers from a combination of steel and wood, materials the Soviets had in abundance. Designed to survive hits that would destroy other aircraft. Designed to keep flying even when damaged. It was a brutalist weapon for a brutalist war. The IL-2 Sturmovik was not a good fighter. It couldn't dogfight. It was slow, clumsy, and ugly. But it was exactly what the Red Army needed. It was a weapon designed not to win elegantly, but to survive and to kill, to absorb punishment and keep fighting, to be produced in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy's ability to stop them. The Luftwaffe aces, the greatest fighter pilots in history, could mock the concrete bomber all they wanted. They could line up perfect shots. They could pour 20-millimeter shells into it, and it wouldn't go down. It would keep flying, keep attacking, keep destroying tanks and trucks and artillery positions and soldiers. And while they were wasting ammunition trying to kill one IL-2, 20 more were overhead, methodically erasing the Wehrmacht from the earth. By 1944, German soldiers on the Eastern Front had a name for the IL-2 that was more accurate than concrete bomber. They called it Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. Because when you saw those formations of IL-2s on the horizon, dozens of them in their dark green and brown camouflage, you knew that death was coming, slow, ugly, unstoppable, and there was nothing you could do about it. The war on the Eastern Front was won by many factors. Soviet manpower, American lend-lease, German overextension, the brutal Russian winter. But one of the most important factors was a crude, ungainly, unkillable aircraft that refused to die no matter how many times you shot it. The flying tank, Stalin's sledgehammer, the IL-2 Sturmovik, the swarm that broke the Wehrmacht,